I'm delighted that y'all are here on this rainy day. Certainly glad to have all of y'all. Appreciate y'all coming out today. I do want to give a shout out to Jeff, who's with us, our former director. Has a great so let's give him thank you for being here, Jeff. Appreciate it very much. I want to thank our workers today, Ms. Shirley and Ron, who are always dependable, and our money changers, and Brenda back there pouring drinks. Thank y'all for helping out today. Appreciate it very much. And before I talk about any other announcements, I'm going to ask our new director, Philip Shackelford, to say a few words.
Okay. Hello again. I appreciate y'all being here, especially as Carol said on this rainy day. So thank you for braving the weather. I just want to hit you with one quick announcement so that you can mark your calendars for next month. I think most of you know already, but just in case you don't, next month's Luncheon with Books will be held in conjunction with Tupelo Reads, February 22nd. That'll be at from 12 to 1 downstairs in the main library area. And Shelby Van Pelt is our guest speaker for that day. The book is downstairs for display. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend you pick it up. But just mark your calendars for February 22nd. And we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Remarkably Bright Creatures is a really good read. So if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, you've still got time before our Tupelo reads later next month. It's really good book. Let me just catch you up on a few things here. Next month, of course, is Tupelo Reads, and then in March, we have our own Philip Shackelford, who will review his book, Rise of the Mavericks, the U.S. Air Force Security Service and the Cold War, 1948 through 1979. So that should be really good. And that will be in March. So hope you look forward to that. Hope you'll come out. One other thing you should, if you're not a official member of the Friends of the Lee County Library, here's a chance to join. There's an envelope on the table, and for only $10. I think it's $5. Is it 10? Oh, it went up. It's just like our lunch. It was now $10 instead of $7. I hope that didn't catch too many of y'all by surprise. But our sandwiches went up, so we had to make up that. Anyway, a student is $5, individual 10, and then if you want to be a grand benefactor, that'd be $10,000. So give that some thought today. And so Greg, you're retired now, but come up with half of it. Anyway, we're just delighted y'all are here, and please consider joining. Let me do a plug for Mary and Lyle. We've got our book sale going on, and if you're looking for some good reads, especially this is winter time and the weather will continue to stay one step ahead of us. Check out our bookshop and pick out a few good reads there. And without any further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. And Mark Neaves is a lifelong resident of North Mississippi and has taught history in Mississippi public schools for the past 20 years, 20 and a half years. He also taught as an adjunct instructor at Lee-Itawamba Community College. He holds a bachelor's degree in social studies education from the University of Mississippi, a master's degree in curriculum instruction from the University of Mississippi, and a master's degree in ministry from Heritage Christian University. It's not on his resume here, but Mark is also an ordained minister, and so he stays pretty busy. He is married to his wife of 23 years, Marty, has 2 children, Riley and Emma Kay, 18 and 10, and he also co-authored a book called Little Fish, Big Splash with his good friend Sean Weaver. He's currently teaching U.S. history at Manatee High School. He loves spending time with his family and being outdoors. If you have a chance, I actually have read the book. I just now bought it, and he autographed it for me. But when I asked him several months ago, when I got his name, I said, "Well, send me a synopsis of the book so I can kind of see if it kind of fits into what we do here." And he sent me the whole review copy, so I've already had a chance to go through it. So, Mark, without anything else, we're delighted to have you, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
be here today. Thank you for the lunch and the warm reception that you've given me. This place has always kind of been a little special to me because I'm a bibliophile. I told them earlier, I said, sometimes my wife says I have too many books. I said, well, at least I'm not an alcoholic. It's worse problems than having too many books. I can remember coming here as a child and looking through the card catalog. You don't get the same feel with the computer, but it is what it is. And to search the shelves and go through all the literature that's available is just still special to me and my family today. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. The way that I wrote this book was I was at a teacher's workshop in Mississippi State, and they were asking about primary documentation and how we teach through primary documents. Well, the man put a cartoon, a political cartoon, many people have seen it, where Teddy Roosevelt and his back turned to this black bear, and the man that is there has a lasso, and my professor had just happened to say that the man in the picture is white, but the man that actually was there was black. And I thought, well, that's unusual. Of course, it was probably a southern newspaper that was in. So I got to researching this particular incident and wanted to know more about it, and that's why I stumbled across Holt Collier and the extraordinary life he lived. Holt, in his lifetime, killed 3,000 bears, more than Davy, Crockett, and Daniel Boone combined. And he was just an extraordinary adventurer. And so we're just going to talk for a few moments today about his life. And if you have any questions, you're good to ask me at the end of this. Hal Hines sat on his front porch, a cigar circle of smoke encompassed his head. He was wondering about how to improve his home field plantation and how to improve his newly purchased plantation called Plum Ridge, which was just north, close to Greenville, Mississippi. Well, of course, the quiet of the night was interrupted by the crying of a little baby boy who had just been born in the slave quarters just across the way. The parents of this baby boy were named Davy and Harrison Collier. As they looked down at that young child as he squirmed with his shock of black hair and dark brown eyes, they had no idea that this young man would become one of the most adventurous men that's ever lived, not only in the state of Mississippi, but in North America. And it's amazing, really, the relationship that he had to the Hines family. And I'm going to give you some background to that because it goes to state how he was treated later on, because there was this familial type relationship that was established between the Colliers, who were slaves, and the Hines family, who were the slave owners. Now, the association with the Hines family went the whole way back to Thomas Hines' marriage to Linda Green in 1807. And so that's 40 years, almost 40 years, and the future Holt was born. And now this Thomas Hines that we're talking about is actually where you have Hines County, Hines Community College, and lots of other things named after him. He was a man of vision. He was a man who went and he fought in the American Revolution. He served as a colonel, and then he moved south and he began a plantation. And of course, one of his slaves was named Allen Collier, who would be the grandfather of Holt. And of course, in the marriage, Laminda had that Allen Collier signed over to her as a present from her father. And so when Allen moved to this new plantation to work under Thomas Hines and Laminda, he was a house servant. Of course, that was much better for the most part. Not that slavery is ever good, because no man deserves to be owned by any other person, regardless of race or color or creed. But he had it better as far as not working in the hot fields of Mississippi. We know what that's like, many of us don't. Because it gets pretty warm, and it's not very pleasant sometimes when it's time to either plant crops or yield them. And so he begins to work in his home. And as Thomas goes off to actually the War of 1812, he participates in a battle in New Orleans. And when he comes back, he's lauded as a hero. He's actually good friends with Andrew Jackson. Of course, many of us are familiar with the Johnny Horton song. It's Johnny Horton, isn't it? Sings the Battle of New Orleans. Well, I used to play that song with my kids when we talked about this time period. And so Thomas comes back, and Laminda and he have a son, and his name's Hal Hines, and he'll eventually take over ownership of the Home Hill plantation. But unfortunately, Laminda dies. This was not completely unusual for this time period. I know recently my wife and I went to Corinth to a cemetery, and I looked, and there were 2 graves followed by 4 graves, and it was a man and a woman, and all 4 of their children had died within pretty close proximity of each other. So death at this point in time wasn't all that unusual. And so we see that Thomas has aspirations to be a politician. He goes and runs for the state legislature. He actually fails when he tries to run for governor, but he's taken away from home a lot of the time, and he entrusts his plantation. He entrusts his young son, Al, in the hands of Allen Collier. And so this familial type relationship begins to grow between them as he acquires the Plum Ridge plantation to expand his estate. Of course, when he goes to Plum Ridge, he leaves Home Hill and the raising of the children and the overseeing of the business in the hands of Harrison Collier. Of course, the man must have been very trustworthy. And as Hal continues to grow, or Thomas continues to grow, he's under somewhat of the tutelage of Harrison Collier. And of course, they were present every day. And they took young Thomas under their wing. And it began, like I said, and that's going to play a huge part into how Holt Collier was treated, because Holt is going to be treated like hardly any other slave, if any, was treated in all of the southern states during this period of time, and all the states that actually owned slaves, which was more than just the southern states. And so when Harrison and Davy had their son, he was raised and somewhat under the tutelage now of Thomas. And so Thomas kind of takes a very big interest in Holt. And Holt, when he's 8 years old, he and his brother actually go out, and their job is to take care of the large pack of hunting dogs that's there on the plantation. Most plantations have large packs of hunting dogs. That was either for sport or for meat. And most of the time in Home Hill plantation, it didn't really require a whole lot of hunting, because it was almost like a very modern type version of a plantation where they had plenty of supplies. Now Plum Ridge, which you'll go to later, is going to be almost a somewhat desolate wilderness, and that's going to play a part in his life also. But as they take care of this large pack of dogs, they become involved and in love with dogs, and this is going to stick with Holt for the rest of his life. He's always going to have some of the largest pack of hunting dogs in the whole state. They're going to also be considered some of the greatest hunting dogs in the state. As a matter of fact, the man that ran the cotton plant, the plantation, I believe some of his dogs came from the same line as Holt Collier. He's going to use those dogs in Africa to hunt lions with. And I can't think of his name right now, I apologize. But he does use those in Africa in order to hunt. So, when he was 10 years old, Hal and Thomas decided they were going to go to Plum Ridge. And they were going to really try to develop this new plantation. And of course, they said the women need to stay behind because it's so much wilderness. But Thomas takes young Holt to be his valet, to be his personal servant. And I can only imagine Holt had never even seen a steamboat before. He says he sees a steamboat and he is so scared of this big contraption that he's never laid eyes on. Thomas, his master, takes his hand and walks him up the gangplank. And when they get there, of course, like I said, and we probably all know this from this past week, groceries are a little scarce on there. And so what they do is give Holt a shotgun and say, listen, we're going to set you on this porch of the slave quarters and you shoot any bird that flies over it. And he does. And they eat those birds. Blackbird pie was one of the big things in big rampant supply. Now Holt, when he was young also, I meant to mention this, swore off alcohol forever. He said that one night he and his father and his master went out hunting and they got rip-roaring drunk. And they hooped and they hollered at the moon. And he said, because of the way they acted, I would never touch alcohol again. Now, he did have two problems, women and gambling. And that's going to be with him for the rest of his life. He's going to be married 3 times. 2 of his wives, we don't really know what happened to him. But back to when he was young, this kind of gives you an insight into his relationship with his family. They gifted him a $215 shotgun. Today, that shotgun would be worth around $7,000. Now, I have several guns at home, but I guarantee you all of those combined probably are not $7,000. And they give this young man that, and he shoots so much and so frequently that his shoulder becomes sore, so he switches to his left shoulder and becomes an ambidextrous shooter. So he can shoot and kill things with both his right and his left shoulder. And then he gets kind of bored of shooting birds and rabbits and things, and he determines he wants to shoot some larger game. Well, they gift him a rifle, and he ends up killing his first bear at the age of 10. My daughter's 10. I can't imagine taking her to kill a black bear in the woods. But that's how old he was when he killed his first black bear. When December 20th, 1860, most of us are aware of what happened. South Carolina withdrew from the United States. And of course, the Confederate States formed. And when the Confederate States formed, Jefferson Davis called for 100,000 volunteers. And when he called for 100,000 volunteers, both Hal Hines and Thomas Hines answered the call. And they went. Thomas Hines was in Burns Artillery Regiment. And of course, Hal was in Jefferson's Flying Artillery. And Holt begged and pleaded, please take me with you. He's probably about 13, 14 years old. And they said, no, we're not doing it. Well, under cover of darkness, after his masters had left, he goes and he stows away on a boat, a ferry boat, and goes to Memphis, Tennessee, and finds his masters and follows them. He'll actually be in the war for longer than they are. And so when they see him, he says, don't you know that you're going to the graveyard? One of the officers asked him, and Holt just smiled and said, I got as good a chance as you. And when his master saw him, he says, if we're going to hell, we're going to have to take that bullet. Because he would follow them wherever he went. First of all, he worked as a personal servant, as many African American slaves did, but it was at the skirmish at the Battle of Green River Bridge when he was actually waiting on a wounded soldier, and he looked around. He thought, I'm the only person here. And he heard the battle in the distance. So what he did is he grabs a musket, he grabs ammunition, he runs to the front lines and he starts firing. He's killing Union soldiers because of his dedication to this family, the Hines family. And so he ends up becoming a soldier. And there's, in 1862, when the Battle of Shiloh took place, and General Johnston, Albert Sidney Johnston, is wounded grievously. And he says, are you wounded? He says, yes. It's serious, I'm afraid, something that turned. And they take him from the field. Holt gives a detailed description of them carrying Johnston from the field. He was the highest ranking general ever killed, I believe, in the Civil War. And of course, after the Southern defeat at Shiloh, Holt and the Confederates go back to Corinth with their spirits broken. And while he's there, though, his life will change forever, because he comes in contact with Company I of the 9th Texas Cavalry. these are young men. For one, they ride horses, which Holt loved. Two, it sure does beat walking everywhere. If you're an infantryman and you're walking 20 miles a day, it beats walking. And three, these guys dressed just the way he envisioned that people should. They had a swept hat, they had boots up to their knees, riding boots, and all these things. And these guys were just very enamored with Holt, and he with them. As a matter of fact, he will dress that way basically for the rest of his life. He will have that sort of style that was by the 9th Texas Cavalry. And so he joins the 9th Texas Cavalry. And I can only imagine what other African Americans who were slaves would have thought at seeing a black Confederate soldier. I'm sure he was not very popular, because they would probably have been pretty angry at this young man who was trying to fight to hold slavery together. But he was led by Captain Perry Evans, and they actually participated in skirmishes around Corinth, the Battle of Holly Springs, the Atlanta campaign, and eventually Nathan Bedford Forrest sent them back to Mississippi and said, listen, we want you to keep law and order, and we want you to make sure that the Union doesn't, pester a lot of the people that are there in Mississippi. And so they did. And they basically, in the Delta, they had martial law. They were the police force. They did what they wanted to do. I'll give you a story here. First of all, there was a preacher on his way to marry this young couple. And of course, if you write a book, I can't remember everything I wrote in there. I can't remember the guy's name, I apologize. I'm already writing another book, so I'm on to something else. But the preacher was leaving, and he was riding along, and he sees Captain Perry Evans, the head of the 9th Texas Cavalry. And he says, where are you going? The preacher says, well, I'm on my way to marry, so-and-so and so-and-so. He said, well, don't worry about it. We killed him and threw him in the river this morning. He stole a mule. So he had shot him, threw him in the river, and that was the end of that man. And of course, the preacher really didn't believe him, but when he got to the house to where he was supposed to marry him, they confirmed that the young man had been killed and thrown in the river. And that was just kind of the frontier justice that the 9th Texas Cavalry had. Now, after the war, Holt chooses, out of all the places he could have gone, after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, all the places he could have gone, he returns back to the plantation where he considered his family there. And one of the things Hal Hines was in charge of was trying to get the cotton picked. Of course, we know the Freedmen Bureau was set up to where African Americans would be hired out as workers and paid. Of course, a lot of people were called carpetbaggers. They were Northerners who came down here to try to make an extravagant profit from a South that was on its knees during Reconstruction. And one of these men was Captain James King. He was going to charge Hal Hines an extraordinary amount per bale of cotton that would be harvested and picked. And of course, the morning that he had changed his mind, Holt went and got him. Well, several days later, that Captain James King was found dead from a gunshot wound in the river, or maybe it's a swamp. He was found dead. And the thing about it is that, of course, a lot of suspicion fell on Holt. And one of the reasons he was one of the last people to see this man. He was actually acquitted of those charges. The thing was, Holt understood that he was a black man living in Mississippi who had just been accused and acquitted of killing a white man. Probably not the best time to stand around in Mississippi. So he gets on his horse and he actually goes to Texas. And when he's in Texas, he works as a cowboy. And a lot of those men didn't really think he could do what he claimed he could do, but he showed them and he worked there as well. While he was there, one of his masters, Thomas or Hal, former masters, was killed. I believe it was hound was killed trying to break up a fight. Holt was angry. He wanted revenge. Well, he comes back to Mississippi, and he actually is going to kill the man that killed his friend, Hal Hines. But the man fled. But when he comes back, he goes back to the plantation. And this is a man who very rarely, Holt had very rarely ever probably either touched a hoe or chopped cotton or did any planting, because most of his stuff was in the house and hunting and those types of things. He didn't want to pick up a hoe. He didn't want to be a sharecropper. So what he decided to do at that time in the Delta, there was a huge lumber boom and there was a huge railroad boom. And of course, with those men working, you gotta have food, right? You gotta have those things that are essential. He decided to be a meat hunter, and he could get 60 pounds for a black bear carcass, and he could get venison, and it was sold by the pound. He literally became very, very wealthy, very relatively, pretty quick. He made $3,000. Sometimes he toted $3,000 around, which would be somewhat the equivalent of me having $40,000 on my person. Now, who totes $40,000? But who was going to take it from Holt Collier? Nobody. This is the same guy that a sheriff would literally, if they would put somebody in jail, he'd put Holt in front of the door and dare people to come lynch that person inside. Guess how many people were lynched with Holt Collier sitting in front of the door with a rifle? 0. He was just that tough a man. And I don't have time, but he also kills an outlaw at Washburn Ferry. But you can read that in the book if you want to. Now, back to the famous hunt that made him really more recognized than probably any black man at this particular time in American history, other than a few, maybe Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, people like that. Teddy Roosevelt had been invited to Mississippi to hunt. And of course, he had Booker T. Washington to come eat, first black man to ever eat at the White House as a guest. And the state of Mississippi, a lot of people were not very kind what they had to say about Teddy Roosevelt when he came to this state. But the thing about it was, Teddy actually at first kind of declines the governor's invitation. It wasn't because he had anything against Mississippi, it's because Teddy was a consummate hunter. And he understood what they were wanting to do was have this big show, have too many people. He wanted to go out in the woods and hunt with a few limited number of people. Well, he ends up agreeing to it. On November the 13th, 1902, he arrives in the Mississippi Delta. As far as I know, he never killed a black bear. He hoped that it was going to be a wonderful hunt. And Roosevelt could not hide his excitement. When he met Holt, he runs up and shakes his hand, and he says, "So this is the guy. I hear you're a great bear hunter." And that left an indelible impression on Holt, because most men of his stature, being the President of the United States, wouldn't have just came up and shook his hand. Now, while they were camped there, they would say that Teddy would come and he would talk to the white part of the camp, and he would come over here and he would talk to the black men who were part of the hunting expedition. Now, at this time, Holt had moved away from meat hunting, and he'd actually started a professional hunting guide service, all expenses paid, and all of these things, tents, wagons, all of these things, and it was very professionally done. So here, the president shows up. He's expecting to bring home a black bear. This is a man who's killed almost every big game animal in North America, probably has except a black bear. And he's going to go on, of course, to kill almost everything in Africa, South America. And Teddy Roosevelt's one of my favorite presidents, not only because he likes to hunt, which I like to hunt, but also just because of his toughness. This is a man who gets shot and gives an hour and something long speech with a bullet in his chest. And when they ask him about it, he says it takes more than a bullet to kill a bull moose when he opens his gut. Tough guy. And so Colonel Roosevelt and Mr. Huger Foote were placed in a blind by Holt. And he says, listen, I'm going to release my dogs and I'm going to run a bear back by here. Well, as you know, if you've ever hunted anything, what you hunt doesn't agree many times with how you want it to hunt. And so they go for hours. And Teddy and Mr. Foote get hungry and they go back to camp. And just as they had left, Holt's dogs turn the bear around, ran it back to where they had been sitting. And it goes down in some water and it begins to kill. It kills one of his favorite dogs. Well, angry, and this is a man who dealt with bears. Now, this is no baby bear, okay? This is a full adult-sized bear. I know a lot of times there's a misconception it was a little tiny bear, but it wasn't. Holt grabs his rifle and beats the bear about the head so much that it becomes discombobulated, and he lassos it, and he ties it to a tree. And when he presents the bear to the president, Roosevelt says, excuse me, but that's too easy. And he turns and he won't kill the bear. Of course, one of the men, Mr. Parker, in there, kills the bear with a knife. And Roosevelt would not kill a black bear on this trip, but he will return again to hunt with a famous African-American guy in Louisiana in 1907. Roosevelt, I think he said his favorite part of that trip, besides killing the bear in 1907, was the possum and sweet potatoes that he ate. I don't know if you're ready to eat possum and sweet potatoes, but that's probably on my list of things I do not eat. So, in 1907, they set up a hunt in Louisiana partially because the Holt Collier had basically almost eliminated the black bear population in the Mississippi Delta. They're moving to Louisiana, and there's another hunter there, and they kind of bet on who is going to kill the most game during this hunt. Of course, Holt left early. He goes down, if you've ever been to Delta, and I haven't, but I've read a lot about it, the cane breaks and those types of things, clears lanes out. Well, he does all that work, and then he goes and gets his dogs, and he comes back, and of course the president's really glad to see him. I mean, they had struck up somewhat of a friendship during that first hunting expedition. And during this, Roosevelt would actually bag a bear with 45-70. He's so happy that he actually hugs the members of the hunting party, and he gifts Holt and 2 or 3 others with 45-70 Winchester 45-70s, which they said would be Holt's prized possession until his life is ended. Now, another thing, Holt was invited with the rest of the members from the Louisiana hunting party to travel to Washington and actually dine at the White House. Holt said, well, there ain't nothing to hunt up there, and there ain't none of my people, so I'll just stay home. And so a lot of folks thought he was crazy for refusing the invitation to the White House, but that was just his mentality, you know. He was at home here in Mississippi. And of course, the first trip and Teddy Roosevelt's refusal to shoot the black bear, she's got a teddy bear with her today, led to the creation of one of the most iconic toys that's ever been. And it's actually, if you don't know this, it's a state toy in Mississippi. It is a state toy. And so the man that actually made the first model sent it to Teddy Roosevelt and asked him, said, can we use your name? And he gave him permission to use his name. Of course, Teddy's a pretty common name, but he still gave him permission. And so it's become very iconic throughout the history of the United States. So after all this takes place, Holt still continues to hunt, but his health begins to decline. He actually lives in Greenville, Mississippi with his third wife, and they have a 2-story house, which will come in handy because in 1927, the river floods, and they actually live on the 2nd floor of their house for a long time. And believe it or not, Holt Collier, a black man from the state of Mississippi, receives a Confederate soldier's pension for the rest of his life. At first, he received a servant's pension, which a lot of African Americans who were slaves did. It served in the war, but one of his officers wrote to the war board and requested that he be given a Confederate soldier's pension because it was more money. And at the age of 90, Holt and his third wife lived through the Great Flood in 1927. He died in August of 1936. He's the only black man in history of the United States to have a national wildlife refuge named after him. And each year, they have the Great Delta Bear Fair in the Delta to commemorate Holt Collier. And I hope to go there one day. And I think one of the men cut with a chainsaw a different figure of a bear and Teddy Roosevelt every single year. But it's one extraordinary story of a man who was able to rise above a lot of restriction in his life because he was so determined and he was so perseverant, and he understood what he was good at, and he went after it, and he lived a life that many people that were of African American the race during that period of time could not have lived. Thank you. Y'all have any questions?
Thank you all very much for coming out on this not so cold, but certainly rainy day. And remember, next month is Two Below Reads, and we'll hope you'll show up for that. So thank you very much for coming.